Welcome back to the one and only Ruby. Let's find out some more things about Ruby's life in Africa. If you remember last time, she had a visitor, Jabari, and we're going to find out today more about that. Our first chapter is called Introductions. We're on page 117. Uncle Ivan smiled. "Ah," he said, "Jabari, the friend you saw today." I nodded. "Yep. Funny thing is, I should have been terrified. Grandma's warning about humans was blaring in my head, but Jabari made it impossible to be afraid. I can't explain it. Maybe it was because he smelled like an elephant. The scent of other calves was on his clothes, his hands, his shoes. Maybe it was the way he contently sang or hummed or talked in a soft, low, wind in the trees voice. Maybe it's the way he knew what I needed before I knew what I needed. I've never met a human who understood elephants as well as Jabari, and I doubt I ever will." Sentinels. There's a word elephants have for those who take care of us. We call them sentinels. A sentinel is someone who looks out for you. It can be someone who's part of your herd, of course, but it could be anyone. Sentinels can be your caretakers or your friends or your teachers or your neighbors. They look out for you. They understand you. They help you. Sentinels make you feel safe. Jabari was my sentinel. So I love the way that Catherine Applegate here gives us all of these examples of sentinel, someone who takes care of you, looks out for you, from an elephant's point of view, because sometimes it's hard to remember that Ruby's telling this story. So everything that we're hearing and seeing come through her eyes. So it's from an elephant's point of view. So that was great examples of that. My mama was a sentinel, of course, and my grandmama, my African herd, was Jinga too. The two bulls who saved my life, the humans flying in the giant insect, and others who helped. Although it took me a while to realize that. I looked at Uncle Ivan and Uncle Bob. My eyes were hot with tears. "You," I said, "you are my sentinels." I sniffled a little. I'm a very lucky elephant. What Jabari knew. Jabari knew I always needed a blanket draped over my back at night. The blankets were thick and heavy, and my favorite one had dots that reminded me of mud spatters and long stripes that reminded me of elephant paths. And here's a picture of Ruby under her blanket. And I had a connection with this. This made me think about weighted blankets that many of us have now. They're heavy and they make us feel safe. This was the same thing for her. Jabari knew I would be hungry right on schedule, every 3 hours. Jabari knew just how to scratch an elephant ear. Jabari knew when I dreamed of awful things and thrashed and moaned that putting his arm around me and humming softly would help me find peace again. And Jabari knew that I needed a new name for my new life. He called me Dunny, and before long, Naya was a fading memory like a morning star. I think maybe Jabari may have been part elephant. First things first, he started with food. Jabari understood what mattered to a baby elephant. Right away, he brought me something in a dented bucket. I heard a sloshing sound, like water in a puddle. I sniffed the bucket with my trunk and took a step backward. Talking and humming as he worked, Jabari dipped his fingers into the bucket. He waved his hand near my trunk, then put his fingertips in my mouth. Again and again, fingers in bucket, fingers to trunk, fingers to mouth. Whatever it was a little bit sweet and a little bit salty and made my mouth water and my trunk twitch. It wasn't my mama's milk, but I wasn't in a position to be picky. In minutes, I was gulping from that bucket. What a mess I made. Reth would have laughed at me, but I didn't care. It had been a long time since my tummy had been so happy. Bob smiles. "There is nothing," he says, "like a bite to eat when you're sure you'll never see food again." So Bob just made a connection to hunger because we know he used to be a stray and he was hungry a lot. So he understands about Ruby's hunger. So he made that connection. An improvement. After 2 days of the messy bucket, Jabari brought me something new. It was shaped like a small clear log and I could see liquid sloshing inside. Jabari held the log upside down and a couple drops plopped to the ground. I sniffed them and knew at once it was the same almost mama's milk I've been drinking from the bucket. Gently, Jabari held out the white log. I tested it with my trunk. It was smooth and cool. I touched the end. It was soft and movable, like hardening honey. I trusted Jabari, but this thing did not make any sense. Unless I thought of my mother, and all at once I understood. This bottle was much easier for me to drink from, and far less messy. I felt Jabari's hand stroking me back as I ate hungrily. When I was done, I burped so loudly that Jabari laughed until his eyes watered. And she never uses the word, but of course, Ruby's drinking from a bottle. And there's the picture. Again, a description through her eyes. The Elephant Orphanage. Although I didn't know it then, the place where Jabari cared for me was called an elephant orphanage. Jabari was one of many caretakers, all working together like bees in a hive. The orphanage was a special place for baby elephants who had been lost and alone. The way it worked was pretty simple. With pretend milk and pretend parents and a pretend life, they were trying to teach us how to survive. But the love was never pretend, never. I love that simile that Catherine Applegate does there. Caretakers, she's comparing those to bees in a hive, showing us how busy they are, because we all know how hard bees work, in and out, all day getting nectar, or making the honey, or taking care of the queen. So, great simile there. Others. Mornings came really early at the orphanage before the stars had run away. It was the stirring babies that woke me with their shuffling and tiny trumpets. Each one was in a wooden enclosure like mine, and each one had a human companion, all day and all night. In my space, there was an extra roommate. His name was Odongo, and he was a young African hedgehog. And here's a picture of Odongo. He was round and spiky with bright, beady eyes and tiny feet. Odongo had been using my place as his home long before I'd gotten there, but he was happy enough to share the space with Jabari and me. He was a quiet roommate, but he liked to sit on my back the way Jigongi used to, and when I had bad dreams at night about Mama, he would cuddle up next to Jabari and me. Aside from Odongo, I hadn't yet met any of my other neighbors. As I calmed a bit, I grew more curious about the other elephants. Each day, I heard a small group of babies head out into the open with their caretakers. Where did they go? If I went too, would I find my family? The babies came back tired, smelling of dirt and sweet leaves. They seemed content, even happy. I wanted to know more. Welcome. Soon enough, I had some answers when I was allowed to join the other babies on their daily adventures. The first time Jabari led me out of my cage to the common area, the babies welcomed me with nuzzles and trumpets and nudges, as if we'd known each other forever. You can see there's little Ruby in the middle at the bottom, with all the other baby elephants. There were 17 elephants at the orphanage where I was. I was in an area called the nursery, along with 5 other babies who were separated from older calves. I never learned how the other babies had ended up at the orphanage. I wasn't there long enough to ask, and nobody talked about their pasts. Sometimes, though, at night, I'd hear one of the babies cry out, and I know I wasn't the only one having bad dreams. So a nursery, we could think of a synonym to nursery as like a daycare. And the smallest room where they keep the babies is the nursery. So Ruby is there with 5 other babies in the nursery part, but we can see there are some older elephants in this part. And so she's gotten to go join them. Milk and mud. Mornings at the orphanage were busy. Before leaving, we all chowed down on our breakfast milk. The huge bottles arrived in a wheelbarrow, and sometimes one of us would try to sneak an early drink. Once we were fed, it was time to begin our walk. Because of the drought, the only mud puddle we could visit was shallow and was just big enough for 3 babies at a time. But that didn't stop us from trying to squeeze the whole group in. Wallowing in mud was my favorite thing to do. Gooey and cool and messy, it was the best. We splashed and tumbled until our caretakers watched to be sure we didn't get carried away, which of course we did. There is nothing better in the whole wide world than being totally covered in mud. Stampede. After some mud fun, we turned to foraging. Even though we were still drinking milk, it was good practice for when we get older. It was hard work looking for leaves and grasses and grabbing them with our trunks. It seemed so easy when the grown-ups did it, but they had tusks and they had lots of practice. I want you to see this picture here of Ruby with a moth on her nose. Or I mean her trunk. That's going to be important in just a minute. One morning, I stuck my trunk into a scrubby bush, hoping to discover a tender leaf or two, when a strange white-winged creature hit me in the forehead. It didn't hurt. I didn't actually feel anything, to tell the truth, but it scared me with its fantastic fluttering. I reared back and tripped on my own feet, landing on another baby who rolled into 2 others. They panicked and dashed off as fast as their little legs could manage, and suddenly we were all running, baby elephants and caretakers alike. It was only when Jabari produced a deafening whistle that we stopped short. Vaneka, the oldest baby, looked at me and said, "You realize that was a moth, right?" "A moth?" I repeated. "But it was so big." The other babies began to giggle. "You're an elephant, Dooney," Vaneka reminded me. You're about a zillion times bigger than a moth." "Well, it bonked me on the head hard," I cried, "and I'm telling you it was gigantic." But even I could hear how ridiculous I sounded. For a few days, the other babies called me Monster Moth, but they got over it eventually. That was the first time I learned how useful it is to be able to laugh at yourself. The Round Bird. By evening, we were all exhausted, but before sleep, Jabari and I always had the same ritual. It involved the silly thing Jabari insisted on wearing on top of his head, a baseball cap. Of course, back then, I didn't know it was called a baseball cap. I just knew it was fun to steal. It worked like this. Jabari would bend down and lean close for a hug, and I would wrap my trunk around his shoulders. Then, just as he pulled away, I would snatch his cap and toss it in the air toward Odongo. It was a pretty good flyer, like a round bird. Odongo would grab the cap when it landed, and sometimes even catch it, and then run to a corner and bury it in the hay. I sure loved that game. Jabari pretended to be annoyed, but I think he loved it too. All right, that's where we're going to stop today. And I just love that section, that great description of Ruby's life at the orphanage and how happy she was. So tune in next time to see what happens next. Bye-bye.